네, 지금 주최기관장을 비롯한 주빈께서 입장하고 계십니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 여러분 안녕하십니까? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 저는 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009의 개회식의 사회를 맡은 태인영입니다. 네, 오늘 이렇게 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009의 개회를 축하해 주기 위해서 참석해 주신 내외 귀빈 여러분 한 분 한 분께 다시 한번 감사의 인사를 드립니다. 교육과학기술부와 한국경제신문, 한국직업능력개발원은 지난 2006년을 시작으로 올해로 벌써 4회째 글로벌 인재포럼을 개최하고 있습니다. 모두를 위한 창의적 인재 양성을 주제로 개최되는 올해 포럼은 65개국에서 200여 명의 석학과 전문가가 참여하고 있고요. 세계 각국이 직면하고 있는 문제 해결 방안을 논의하고 또 미래 번영을 위한 인재 개발의 지혜를 나눌 수 있는 아주 좋은 기회가 될 것으로 생각합니다. 자, 그럼 지금부터 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009의 개회식을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 인류 역사를 되짚어보면 예로부터 새 시대를 여는 창의적 인재가 언제나 새로운 역사와 패러다임을 전 인류에게 소개해 왔습니다. 오늘날 전 세계가 직면한 환경, 경제, 인권 등의 모든 문제 해결 열쇠는 역시 창의적인 인재가 아닐까 이런 생각이 듭니다. 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009의 주제인 모두를 위한 창의적 인재 양성을 테마로 한 주제 영상으로 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
What makes companies work, and what makes cultures work, and what motivates people to create.
Welcome to the first Global Human Resources Forum. In an age where knowledge is the foundation of growth, and investment in human capital is a key driver of economic success,
네, 올해 글로벌 인재 포럼의 주제 영상을 감상하셨습니다. 다음으로는 이번 행사를 준비하신 주최기관의 대표님들의 환영사가 있겠습니다. 먼저 안병만 교육과학기술부 장관님을 모시고 말씀을 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 큰 박수로 무대 위로 모시겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 오늘 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009에 참석해 주신 국내외 귀빈 여러분을 진심으로 환영합니다. 특히 기조 연설을 맡아주신 게르하르트 슈레더 전 독일 총리님, 프레드 버그스텐 피터슨 국제연구소 경제연구소 소장님, 그리고 바쁜 가운데 포럼에 참석해 주신 솜콧 막노맥 라오스 교육부 장관님, 그리고 세계적인 석학과 대학 총장님, 글로벌 기업의 최고 경영자를 비롯한 국내 귀빈 여러분께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 존경하는 내 귀빈 여러분, 잘 아시는 바와 같이 최근에 세계는 기후, 환경, 에너지 위기, 전 세계적인 경제 둔화 등 다양하고 급격한 변화와 도전에 직면해 있습니다. 현재의 어려움을 극복하고 미래를 선도적으로 준비하기 위해서는 무엇보다 사람에 대한 투자가 중요합니다. 기업, 사회가 요구하는 창의적인 인재 양성이야말로 국가 경쟁력 확보의 원천이라고 생각합니다. 그렇기 때문에 전 세계의 많은 나라들이 앞다투어 창의적 인재를 어떻게 양성하고 활용할 것인가에 대하여 깊이 고민하고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 학생 개개인의 행복 측면에 있어서도 잠재된 소질과 창의력을 최대한 개발할 수 있는 교육 기회를 제공받는 것이 그 무엇보다도 중요합니다. 그러나 현실은 국가 간 교육 역량과 사회 경제적 여건의 차이 때문에 학생 개개인이 받는 교육의 질과 기회가 공평하지 않은 것 또한 사실입니다. 이와 같은 현실을 고려할 때 오늘 포럼의 주제인 모두를 위한 창의적인 인재 양성은 국제사회가 함께 고민해 봐야 할 매우 중요하고도 시적절한 주제라고 생각합니다. 오늘 포럼이 주제에 걸맞게 각 국가 내의 창의적 인재 양성과 교육 격차 해소뿐만 아니라 국제적으로 어려운 국가의 젊은이들 교육에 대해서도 함께 고민하고 관심을 갖는 자리가 되기를 기대합니다. 한국 정부는 교육 현장에서의 자율과 창의를 바탕으로 교육 격차가 해소되고 개개인의 잠재력이 최대한 개발되는 교육 시스템을 구현하고자 합니다. 더불어 개도국을 포함한 외국의 우수한 학생들을 초청, 교육 연구하도록 하는 글로벌 코리아 스칼러십 프로그램을 통해 인재개발 분야에서의 국제적인 역할과 기대를 지속적으로 확대해 나가겠습니다. 앞으로 이틀간 활발한 토론을 통해 각국의 선진 사례와 경험을 공유해 주시고 한국의 정책에 대해서도 애정어린 충고는 물론 미래를 여는 해안을 나누어 주시기를 부탁드립니다. 나아가 여러분들의 노력이 이번 포럼을 넘어 지구촌 곳곳으로 확산되어 결실을 맺기를 원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 장관님 감사합니다. 다음은 신상민 한국경제신문 사장님의 인사 말씀이 있겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
여러분 안녕하십니까? 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009에 참석하신 국내외 귀빈 여러분께 우선 고맙고 반갑다는 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 특히 이 포럼을 위해 귀한 시간을 내주신 게르하르트 슈레더 전 독일 총리님께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 저희 한국경제신문은 기술과 환경이 아무리 급변해도 결국 사람이 성장과 발전의 원동력이라는 판단 아래 지난 2006년 교육과학기술부 그리고 한국직업능력개발원과 함께 글로벌 인재 포럼을 만들었습니다. 그동안 미래인재의 요건과 글로벌 협력의 필요성 등에 대해 논의해오며 올해로 4번째를 맞았습니다. 참석자 여러분, 주지하다시피 이미 사회 곳곳에서 인재는 미래를 좌우하는 가장 중요한 키워드가 됐습니다. 기업들은 기술과 환경이 급변함에 따라 기존 역량 이상의 잠재력을 가진 새로운 인재를 요구하고 있고 공공부문 그리고 비영리 부분에서도 새로운 시각을 가진 창의성 넘치는 인재들이 더 많이 필요해졌습니다. 미래를 짊어질 인재 양성에 관한 한 학교와 정부 그리고 기업들이 힘을 합치는 교류와 협력이 더욱 중요해지고 있는 때입니다. 인재 문제는 또 전 세계가 같이 직면하고 있는 당면 과제이기도 합니다. 세계적인 인재 이동이 가속화되고 있고 교육 불균형을 해소하기 위한 글로벌 차원의 협력도 모색되고 있습니다. 글로벌 인재 포럼은 이렇게 경쟁과 혁신의 기존 영역과 지역을 넘나드는 시대에 어떤 인재를 양성해 미래에 대비할 것인가를 논의하는 가장 이상적인 국제 행사라고 할 수 있습니다. 이번 포럼에는 그동안의 연구 성과를 발표하고 새로운 아젠다를 제시하기 위해 65개국 200여 명의 석학과 전문가 그리고 글로벌 기업의 대표들이 연사로 참여했습니다. 이틀간의 짧은 기간이지만 연사분들의 필생의 연구와 경험을 전하고 또 청중으로 참여하는 많은 분들이 유익한 정보와 신선한 통찰을 얻어가는 장이 되기를 바라는 마음 간절합니다. 앞으로도 이 포럼이 세계의 인재 관련 하도를 선도하는 영향력 있고 신뢰 높은 국제 포럼이 될 수 있도록 저희들이 할 일을 다하고자 합니다. 다시 한번 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009에 참석하신 모든 분들께 환영의 인사를 전하며 여러분의 건승과 발전을 빕니다. 고맙습니다.
네, 따뜻한 환영의 인사 말씀이었습니다. 그럼 마지막으로 한국직업능력개발원 권대봉 원장님의 환영사가 있겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
앞에 두 분께서 영어로 한국어로 하셔서 제가 영어로 인사를 드리겠습니다. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are living in the 21st century. However, we are challenged by many problems, such as poverty, conflicts, pollution, disease, climate change, and etc. These problems can be solved depends on the way how to provide education. This week, we get together under the theme of creative education for all. Therefore, we have a mission not only solve these problems, but also enhance the quality of life by providing creative education for all. Creative education should not be enjoyed by only a few. Creative education should be for everyone, should be for every nation. For this, Global collaboration is needed, and I believe this forum can facilitate and suggest practical solutions. I hope through this forum we can develop pragmatic strategies for promoting creative education for all, and that green growth upheld by the Korean government progresses to global green growth to bring forward global prosperity. Please allow me to ask for your strong support and interest throughout this forum, as well as for constructive criticism. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.
네, 권대봉 원장님 감사합니다. 다음은 축사의 순서입니다. 바쁜 국정 일정 때문에 직접 행사에 참석하시지는 못하셨지만 그 누구보다도 인재 양성에 대한 큰 관심과 신념을 갖고 계신 이명박 대통령님의 축하 영상 메시지를 보시겠습니다. 네, 본 행사의 성공적인 개최를 위해서 축하의 말씀을 영상으로 해주신 이명박 대통령님 진심으로 감사합니다. 자, 이것으로 글로벌 인재 포럼 2009 개회식을 마치고 21세기 글로벌 리더십의 청사진이라는 주제의 기조 연설을 들으시겠습니다. 401 G20 기획조정위원장 겸 한국무역협회 회장님, 게르하르드 슈레더 전 독일 총리님, 프레드 버그스텐 피터슨 국제경영연구소 소장님을 이 세 분을 단상으로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 네, 먼저 기조연설의 좌장은 401 회장님께서 맡아서 진행해 주시겠습니다. 401 회장님 부탁드립니다.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great privilege for me It is a great privilege for me to participate in this forum with so many distinguished participants from all over the world. I am especially honored to share this podium with one of the leading statesmen of our time and another keynote speaker who is one of the most distinguished and respected intellectual leaders of our time. It will take whole morning to properly introduce them to you. But because of time constraint, I will try to be brief, although I may do injustice to them. The first keynote speaker is former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder. Gerhard Schroeder has been a major force on the world's political stage for nearly a decade. Known for his charismatic delivery and unparalleled insights, Chancellor Schroeder is a leading world statesman and internationally recognized authority on global relations, economic development, and social change. Gerhard Schroeder is the first of a new generation of vibrant German leaders. He took on the newly reunited Germany and boldly ushered the world's third largest economy into the 21st century. Gerhard Schroeder was elected Chancellor in 1998. In his 7 years in office, Gerhard Schroeder did more to modernize Germany's economy than had been accomplished in decades. Elected to a second term in 2002, Chancellor Schroeder increased his country's influence on global level by taking strong stance on global issues. No wonder one of the leading German newspaper hailed Chancellor Schroeder as the most charismatic German politician since Willy Brandt. We are very fortunate to have him this morning here at this forum. The next keynote speaker is Fred Bergsten, who is my personal friend for many years, who is currently the director of the Peterson Institute of Economics based in Washington, D.C. This Peterson Institute has been formally named as Institute for International Economy. Fred Bergsten has been director since its creation in 1981. Of course, he created this institute. The institute is the only major research institution in the United States devoted to international economic issues. A recent comprehensive survey of global think tanks concluded that Peterson Institute is I quote, the most influential think tank on the planet. What more can you say? And Fred himself has been the most widely quoted think tank economist in the world. In fact, he is known to be the most influential person in Washington outside the US government in the field of international economic policies. Once USA Today described him as one of the 10 people who can change your life. Well, Fred has been producing many books and many articles and gives testimonies and in Congress and appears on TV and media, and he still is going very strong and work very hard. Well, with this very brief introduction, I'd like to invite Chancellor Schroeder to give his keynote speech. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to provide some thoughts on the subject of leadership and on some of today's key political questions, particularly on the global financial and economic crisis, the changing world affairs, and the new role of government. I would like to share some of the experiences I have made in my 7 years as Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. So, what are the greatest challenges the world community is faced with when we talk about leadership? Firstly, the challenge of a financial crisis such as we have not known in the past 80 years, as well as a difficult situation in all important economic areas of the world. Secondly, climate change, one of the largest global political and economic threats we face today. And thirdly, the central question of international political decision-making today, namely, how can we establish and maintain peace and security in a world that has changed dramatically after the end of the Cold War? Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting takes place during a difficult economic period. In the world of finance, the turbulence in the past months has led to dramatic changes. Speculative excess has shattered the market with severe consequences for national economies. As a recent survey showed, the worldwide losses of the financial crisis have amounted to roughly $10 trillion. Referring these sum to the world population, the average loss per capita has been more than $1,500. The community of states must, therefore, act in order to restore trust in banks and insurance companies. Thanks to government measures, we have now managed to stabilize the financial systems of most national economies. It is undoubtedly positive that the national solutions were agreed upon in an international framework. This is because isolated national solutions cannot have any effect on the global financial market. Ladies and gentlemen, we need functioning regulating institutions, national and international. Banks and insurance companies should not be allowed to act globally while the bodies that regulate them are stuck in national structures. This is a precondition that will allow financial markets to once again concentrate on their fundamental task to serve consumers and to provide them with serious investment opportunities. The credit market must get off the ground again, because if it does not, the opposite effect between a negative economic atmosphere, restraint in granting loans, and resulting negative effect on the economic situation would intensify. All measures to stimulate international dynamics can only take hold if trust is re-established between the banks of the interbank market. In order to rebuild this trust, the banking system has not had access to necessary capital and refinancing possibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, reacting in short and mid-term to the global financial crisis is one side of the coin. The other is the reaction to the real economic consequences of the financial crisis. As a consequence, world trade dramatically dropped by roughly 30%, a reduction never seen in the last 8 decades. In this context, some people spoke of a tsunami. I think that is a good picture to illustrate the situation, because a really destructive phase of a tsunami is not the first wave, but the phase the water is floating back again, carrying all the garbage and impacting on a structure destabilized by the first hit. Well, this second phase wave happened in the first months of the year. We all were shocked by the rapid negative dynamics of the downturns at the beginning of the year. But politicians and central banks, especially here in Korea, all over the world, have reacted fast and in the right way. This in contrast to the Great Depression in the last century, when politics reacted in a wrong way. The capacity of the internationally launched economic stimulus packages amount to approximately 4% of the global gross domestic product. The largest stimulation packages were passed in the United States of America with almost $800 billion and in China with approximately $500 billion. And now, in autumn of this year, we can say, in the face of a lack of internal as well as external demand, these programs have worked, and we therefore can see clear signs of recovery. So, Germany, besides Japan, the most heavily hit country, last month surprised with positive data for the second quarter in 2009. But in sum, the German gross domestic product this year will be around about 4.5% lower than 2008. And for the next year, we can expect a growth rate of around 1.5%. And such a bottoming out of the recession we can observe in the other important countries as well. Even if the mid-future is not regarded with total skepticism, the conclusions are obvious. We must now do everything possible at a national and international level to get the global economy back up and running as quickly as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, there was another turning point that occurred in the course of the financial crisis that I welcome. The time has come to to recognize the international importance newly industrialized countries have come to enjoy. Countries, particularly the BRIC states, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as well as the Republic of Korea, have become economically and politically more powerful in the last years. Along with an increase in power comes a greater international responsibility. Demanding this is one side of the coin. The other is putting an end to the two-class politics in the community of states. These countries must be allowed to have more influence in international institutions. This applies to the financial institutions such as the IMF, in addition to other international committees. And therefore, it is really important that a country like the Republic of Korea is hosting the next G20 meeting. During my term in office as Chancellor, I suggested that both the G8 and the UN Security Council should have a broader base. These institutions must also undergo comprehensive reforms so that both newly industrialized and developing countries, as well as important European nations, are properly represented. The financial crisis has made it abundantly clear that we can only solve international challenges if we do so together. We have to continue firmly on this path. This is not only the basis for a successful global economy, but also for peace and stability in international relations. Ladies and gentlemen, another reason to integrate newly industrialized countries in international institutions is that in order to stabilize the financial markets, we need their financial resources that are tied up in sovereign wealth funds. By investing in banks and insurance companies, these countries can make a contribution to the flow of new capital into a financial system. We need these kinds of investments in other economic areas. The economies all over the world are dependent on foreign investment, not only for its capital, but also for its knowledge and know-how. National economies are strong because of their presence in international markets. The success of this presence, however, always depends on the openness of one's own market. Open markets are important, appropriate, and necessary. In order to take advantage of the opportunities open markets provide, however, we need to have competitive companies in the industrial sector. These must be companies that can survive in international markets. This is possible when investment of foreign capital and, in some cases, necessary. Such capital must also come from foreign sovereign wealth funds and state enterprises. Our goal must also be to integrate the emerging economies as equal partners in the global economic network. This is primarily possible by means of international regulations that strengthens transparency, free market access, and legal security. But even more important, I believe, is that increased global economic integration of these countries will lead to an economic opening up, which in turn will result in domestic modernization, the rule of law, and internal pluralism. Ladies and gentlemen, the financial crisis has made it abundantly clear that globalization seriously affects the scope for maneuver not only of nations, states, but also of private enterprises. Each and every individual feels the consequences of globalization in his or her daily life. Many feel helplessly exposed to these processes and their impacts. Such criticism must be taken seriously. Leading politicians around the globe are called upon to convince their population of the development opportunities of globalization for all. Opportunities which are generated by global business activity and free world trade. But we will only succeed if we influence and control the process of globalization. In other words, what we really need is a human process of globalization. That is why I feel that when it comes to globalization, political decision-making is important. Faced with ever faster change in our global economic system, we really need a reliable set of rules and agreements we all can abide by. Such rules would guarantee the free development of competition and world trade. We must do all we can to involve all countries in the global network of economic activity. We cannot afford to see the world falling into two camps, those who benefit from globalization and those who suffer. As free trade increases opportunities for prosperity, we must ensure that especially poorer countries are given access to markets around the globe. They must not be kept out by means of punitive customs duties or protectionist provisions. What we need is better market access for products from developing countries, and we must also eliminate subsidies distorting the natural flow of trade. This is why, in recent years, I have strongly supported progress in Doha World Trade Round. What we now need is a joint effort by all WTO members to take the major steps so urgently needed for global economic development. On the one hand, this will involve a reduction of customs duties on industrial goods as well as a liberalization of services. On the other hand, a success will necessitate the reduction of agriculture subsidies. Finding a compromise will mean that everybody must move and make concessions, both the United States of America and, of course, Europe. In a globalized world, multilateral trading systems are superior to other systems because they are fairer. A multilateral approach is the only one geared to letting many people feel and see the tangible benefits arising from globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that we can only continue to guarantee prosperity and social stability in the era of globalization if we focus consistently on education, research, and innovation. Greater effort is needed in these areas. We could do better. What we need in all industrial societies is greater investment in the future, more investment in childcare, in schools and universities, in research and development. If we want to be successful in the future, economically, scientifically, and culturally, then we have to make full use of the potential that our societies have to offer in terms of talent, aptitude, and skills. And I stress all talents we have in our nations. No talent must be allowed to remain undiscovered. We must exhaust all our reserves. Each and every individual must be given the opportunity to receive a first-class education. Where parents' resources are not sufficient, state and society must help out by means of support programs and grants. We can no longer afford a situation where a good education is conditional upon parents' income. This kind of first-class education determines the future of each young person and the opportunities on the job market. But at the end of the day, it also determines the ability to compete. In industrial societies, we also need a greater openness towards technological developments. The future can only be won by progress in the field of innovation. This applies in particular to areas of transport and energy, genetic engineering, information and communication. If you want to transform good ideas in successful products, you have to be creative and prepared to take the risks. The government task is to play an active role in supporting this process. For this to work, the financial conditions for research in these fields need to be improved. And we also need to generate enthusiasm within our societies, especially among young people, for the whole area of innovation and science. What we need, particularly in Europe, is a mood that once again places a high value on research and innovation. This is a challenge that needs to be met not only by politicians, but also by industry and society. It is only by working together that we can bring about a change in public perception. Ladies and gentlemen, another tremendous challenge for the international community is climate change. The UN report on climate change made it abundantly clear. If we do not urgently take action, the global climate could change so radically that it becomes uncontrollable. We already see the first signs with flooding, desertification, and extreme weather phenomena, bringing suffering to millions of people around the globe. 11 of the last 12 years were the warmest since global temperature records exist. In this century, the average global temperature could increase by up to 5.8 degrees Celsius. For millions of people, the climate change jeopardizes access to the most important resource of all, water. Already today, 1.3 million people do not have clean drinking water, and this number is rising. In the Middle and Far East, water is becoming a rare commodity to be fought over. The living conditions for billions of people will deteriorate, and poverty and violence will increase. Migratory pressure will intensify. Climate change bears political risks because it threatens geopolitical stability. But it also represents an economic threat due to the huge cost associated with ecological damage. That is why we must reach international agreement in order to reduce the so-called greenhouse gases and thus slow down climate change. This means we need a more sustainable energy policy which preserves resources and reduces our dependency on fossil fuels such as oil and gas. We will only achieve this by driving energy efficiency and investing in renewable energy. Increased energy efficiency is one of the key preconditions for effective climate protection, and it enables greater independence from oil, gas, and uranium. Power generation is a prime area for greater energy efficiency, but there's also enormous potentials for savings in both private housing and in motor vehicles. Today, in Germany, a newly built power plant is 20% more efficient than one that was built in 1985. And meanwhile, Germany is in the lead of international in energy efficiency. This also applies to the expansion of renewable energies. My country has technological leadership in this field. The major industrial and threshold countries must take the lead and agree on a common strategy for modernizing power generation. The decisions that countries such as China or India, but also America, take in the generation of energy will be crucial for the future of climate protection. China, for example, as an up-and-coming industrial nation, accounts for roughly 20% of worldwide CO2 emissions. Finally, however, we start to see a more appropriate reaction. By 2020, China, for example, proposes to triple the amount of hydropower. It will produce 30 times more wind energy and 12 times more energy generated from solar and biosources than today. These are all steps in the right direction, but they are certainly not sufficient. We cannot and must not live at the expense of our children and grandchildren. That is, where there is no choice, we have to make radical changes to our energy policy, because mankind has no alternative if we want to avoid the world becoming inhabitable. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, the third challenge we are facing is the international security situation. The 21st century has not made our world a safer place. New dangers have arisen. We now face the threat of international terrorism. There is privatized violence, the disintegration of entire states and their structures, and the fear of weapons of mass destruction. Old, long-lasting regional conflicts block peace and stability, both in the affected region and far beyond. Energy security and, more generally, the issue of access to vital raw materials will strongly influence the global security agenda in the 21st century. Over the past few years, the global framework of resource supplies had changed dramatically. This especially applies to the field of energy, because there is a huge demand from nations such as China and India, who are pushing into world markets. Germany, Europe, and the United States of America will see a continued increase in the demand for fossil fuel imports, despite all their efforts to develop renewable energies. And some countries that exported oil and gas will soon reach the end of their reserves, and they will become importers of energy too. In recent months, we saw how sensitively energy market responded to changes in supply and demand. That is why it is important that we establish a clear strategy for bringing secure energy supplies into the global economy. And for this, we need a multilateral approach. I believe that energy issues cannot be handled in a unilateral way. We all have to work together towards global energy security. Even if competition increases in the future, we must not allow energy to become the currency of power in international relations. We need a cooperative energy security strategy. A system of cooperative energy security must promote dialogue among energy producers, consumers, transit states, and the private sector. And we need safe, reliable, and politically stable energy exporting nations. We must stabilize fragile regions and countries that are threatened by disintegration. This is necessary both to ensure reliable international raw material supplies and to make sure that exporting countries and their populations profit from the wealth generated by selling energy resources. Moreover, we need to invest in new infrastructure in the fields of exploration as well as diversification. As I mentioned before, in the long run, the most important contribution towards a reliable energy supply is the careful use of resources. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's world, there is no country that would see fit to master all these new challenges on their own. The tasks we are facing require a strong and effective multilateral system based on the rule of law rather than on the idea of survival of the fittest. A multilateral system providing a reliable framework for cooperation and solidarity between the respective states and allowing for global functioning despite differing and often controversial interests of the individual players involved. That is also true for the international security situation. We are all aware that security cannot be guaranteed by police or military means alone. In the long run, the fight against terrorism can only be won if people feel that there's a degree of success in their lives, when they experience that saying no to violence and terrorism does indeed pay a dividend. A return into international community not only leads to more freedom and security, but also brings better opportunities for development and degree of prosperity. If we want to withdraw the breeding ground of fanaticism, we must create more political, material, and cultural security around the world. Consequently, we must do all we can to encourage and support stability in the Middle East. This applies first and foremost to Iraq. Stability in Iraq and beyond will only be possible when all countries in the region are included in the process. In this context, Syria has a critical role to play, but dialogue with Iran is also important. In Afghanistan, responsibility for the country must be turned over to the Afghans. This requires both international assistance and, above all, the will of the Afghans themselves. The Afghans' leadership is deficient in this regard. Too often, those in Kabul have relied on international donors to make things right. It is important to strengthen Afghan self-reliance, especially when it comes to the development of administrative structures, the police and infrastructure. And the Afghan government must agree to ensure that funds are given without corruption to the places where they are truly needed. I believe that the time has come, more than 7 years after the overthrow of the Taliban, to establish a time frame for the transition to Afghan self-reliance, which would be tied up to the beginnings of international troop withdrawal. With concentrated and intensified international commitment, it would be possible to create the conditions within the next 6 years so that responsibility is gradually returned to the Afghan authorities and security forces. This would pave the way for withdrawing the international troops. And finally, we need a long-lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This conflict negatively impacts on other crisis-stricken countries, such as Iraq or Afghanistan. A peaceful settlement is especially important for us Europeans, as this conflict takes place in a neighboring region and thus in a direct threat to our security. Any peaceful solution must provide the State of Israel with secure, reliable borders, as well as establishing Palestine as a sustainable state. This objective can only be achieved when Syria and Iran, both important players in the region, were also included in the peace process. We will only see an improvement in the Middle East when its countries are more strongly integrated in the world. These steps can lay a solid foundation for peace and development in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that the way the international community of states come to grips with the financial and economic crisis will determine how our global cohabitation develops politically, economically, and culturally. The election of the American president has sparked hope in people worldwide that cooperation rather than confrontation will dominate international politics. This pertains to the fair organization of globalization, the major conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and between Israel and Palestine, as well as with regard to Iran's nuclear program. We must resume on the path of partnership in international politics. For this, we need to make use of the instruments on which good old Europe has always been based: dialogue and cooperation. This is also the guiding principle needed to overcome the financial and economic crisis. Only when we are active and committed participants can we also create new perspectives for our own country. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for very, very comprehensive but detailed accounts of current global issues. I thank you very much again for sharing with us your very deep insights and the foresights as well. I don't think I need to summarize what Chancellor Schroeder just said, but he covered a very wide range of issues. He covered ongoing global financial and economic crisis and the both downsides and upsides of globalization and the importance of education and innovation and research, and then the climate change. In connection with climate change, he emphasized very much on the energy saving and energy efficiency. I'm very sure that we can learn a lot from German experience in this regard. And also he covered food energy, the energy security issues, and international securities, regional security issues covering Afghanistan to Iran and the Israel and the Palestinian issues. But at the end, what he emphasized is the global cooperation, international cooperation, and the policy coordination. It is critical for overcoming the current financial crisis and economic crisis and solving all these medium to long-term global issues. So I again express my gratitude to Chancellor for sharing his insights. I'm sure later on when you have questions or comments at the end of this the presentation, and you will have opportunity then. So at this point, I would like to invite Fred Bergsten to give his presentation. Please welcome, please join me.
I want to thank very much the sponsors of this forum for inviting me to come back to Korea. I have had the great privilege and pleasure of working very closely on the Korean economy for more than 40 years. And it's a great opportunity to be back again and to see so many old friends and to meet so many new friends as well. I also want to thank my very close friend, Dr. SaKong Il, for his very generous introduction. Dr. SaKong is providing exactly the kind of creative leadership that this forum is all about, as he takes a critical role in Korea's international position, chairing, as it does, the group of 20 leading countries who provide the central role in coming to grips with the global economic crisis. And I want to say what a privilege it is to share the podium with Chancellor Schroeder. Chancellor Schroeder displayed enormous political courage in carrying out major economic reforms in Germany, the third largest economy in the world, and he deserves great credit for helping generate the kind of global economic leadership that we all need in this period. The theme of this forum is the need for creative global leadership based on education for all. The need for such leadership is now greater than ever due to the global economic crisis, the deepest that we have experienced in the world since the 1930s. In this critical situation, Korea is becoming chair of the G20, the group of leading economies who bear the responsibility to develop policies that will lead the world back to sustained prosperity and stability. And Korea must, in fact, provide the creative global leadership itself that will put the world on this path over the coming year or so. Hence, I think it is entirely appropriate, in fact necessary, for Korea to take the lead in organizing and conducting this Global Human Resources Forum to help provide the foundation for this essential leadership role that this great country is now playing and will play even more so over the next year. My assignment today is to offer a blueprint for global leadership in the 21st century, and I will try to do that by describing the global economic situation that we face today and what needs to be done to place it on a successful and sustainable course for the years and indeed decades ahead. Our current international economic system was created at the end of the Second World War, more than 60 years ago. Its overarching goals were to avoid a repetition of the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was severely deepened by the trade wars and competitive currency devaluations of that period, and to prevent the worldwide military conflict that ensued. The global economic system has evolved considerably over recent decades, but its basic structure, until quite recently, has remained that of 60 years ago. Now comes the Great Recession of 2008-2009, by far the worst for the world economy since the 1930s. And this period is providing the first real stress test for the global economic order that was created after 1945. This was the first truly global economic turndown in modern history, with most countries experiencing sharp reductions in their level of economic activity, and virtually everyone experiencing at least a sharp decline in growth rates. The situation required an effective global response, really for the first time in many decades. Moreover, it has been widely argued that the existence of the Bretton Woods system, the post-World War II architecture, was a major reason that the 1930s could never happen again. So how has the system responded? What is the record in attempting to pass that stress test for the global economic order? To date, I would say the results are mixed. Virtually all countries have adopted a combination of monetary and fiscal stimulus measures that appear to have arrested the precipitous downward slide and, in most cases, restored at least some positive economic momentum. Korea is doing especially well, with the economy growing at an annual rate of more than 13% from the second quarter to the third quarter of this year. The United States is not doing quite so well, but also reasonably successful, recording economic growth of 3.5% in the third quarter, and indeed a growth of domestic demand of over 4%, which is what counts for the global economy. In addition to these positive developments, the key international institutions, mainly the International Monetary Fund and the newly ascended G20, have played important supportive coordinating roles, and the IMF has come to the rescue of some countries that were hardest hit. In addition, the rules and procedures of the World Trade Organization have helped limit the damage from the inevitable outbreak of protectionism in a number of countries. And there have been only a few competitive currency devaluations, although the ongoing sizable currency undervaluation in China, which predates the crisis by several years, remains of significant importance and concern. Several of the specific actions taken in recent months by the key international institutions have been particularly helpful. The G20, at its April summit, agreed to triple the resources of the IMF to enable it to respond to crisis requirements. The creation of $250 billion worth of special drawing rights at the IMF Both provided additional stimulus to the world economy in the short run and limited the need of countries to run big trade surpluses to self-insure against subsequent crises in the long run. The G20's standstill agreements on trade barriers to avoid imposing new restrictions, albeit implemented imperfectly, have surely helped preserve the relative openness of the commercial system, which Chancellor Schroeder quite rightly emphasized. And so the calamitous outcomes, the disaster scenarios for the world economy that were so widely feared just a year ago seem to have been averted, due in important part to these constructive responses of the global economic order. At the same time, the crisis has revealed or re-emphasized a number of key shortcomings in our international economic system that the current generation has inherited from the past. Financial regulation, both within and between countries, proved inadequate to prevent the meltdown that triggered the global crisis. The buildup and continuation of huge international imbalances, current account surpluses and deficits, with their accompanying huge international capital flows, those clearly contributed substantially to the over-leveraging of finance and the underpricing of risk, especially in the United States, where the crisis erupted. The inability of the trading system to revive its past momentum of liberalization through the Doha round or otherwise created a vacuum within which protectionist initiatives could more easily flourish. We know from history that unless the trading system is moving steadily forward toward liberalization, that there exists a vacuum into which pressures to backslide all too often prevail, and we have seen that in the recent months and years as well. These continuing problems create a huge and challenging agenda for the G20, the new steering committee for the world economy. Korea assumes the chairmanship of this group in 2010 and thus faces a huge responsibility, as well as a series of daunting challenges to lead the world economy back to enduring prosperity and stability. Now, underlying these manifestations of systemic inadequacy that I have already mentioned were a series of fundamental structural problems that were already apparent, but which the crisis has pressed to the fore. I mentioned the IMF positively in some respects, which I know is a dangerous thing to do here in Korea, where memories of the IMF crisis of a decade ago are still fresh. But I also would note that the IMF has failed very badly to exercise any kind of effective surveillance over the policies of its major member countries, or to create mechanisms that would foster coordination of either their macroeconomic policies or their financial regulation. There have been revealed clear gaps in the rules and institutional arrangements themselves, including the inadequacy of macroprudential guidelines in the financial domain, a fairly new problem, or any instruments to induce adjustment to the big imbalances by large surplus countries, a perennial problem dating back to Bretton Woods itself, which was in fact a preoccupation of John Maynard Keynes at the time. And we can now see clearly that the previous global steering committee, the G7 or the G8, had failed miserably to provide effective leadership for the global system, requiring the shift to a new institutional arrangement based on the G20. Now, in addition to these critical systemic problems that were revealed or emphasized by the crisis, there are a number of other issues where the international economic architecture clearly must be expanded and or reformed. The most obvious is the need for a global regime on climate change, which Chancellor Schroeder also referred. Those, of course, are being negotiated now, but must provide an effective new mechanism to save the planet. A second big structural area is the global role of the dollar, and indeed the international monetary system more broadly, as the world moves toward a bipolar currency regime with the rise of the euro, and as monetary reserves are again being augmented by creation of special drawing rights at the IMF. A number of major countries, China, Russia, Brazil, and others, have raised these questions of the role of the dollar, and it too must be placed on the global agenda. A third area relates even more broadly than I've mentioned already to the global trading system and the World Trade Organization. The WTO has lagged very badly in addressing the trade dimensions of a number of topics that have become central to the world economy. Climate change, where any international agreement will have to have a trade component to avoid adversely affecting the competitive position of individual countries and thus their willingness to contribute to the control of carbon emissions. Tightened security procedures in many countries since 9/11 and subsequent terrorist attacks have had important implications for border controls and security measures, which the WTO has not yet come to grips with. Currency manipulation, as most notably by China, but a number of other countries in continental Asia, not Korea, incidentally. But currency manipulation by a lot of countries has undermined and distorted trade patterns, but the trading system has not responded to them. Foreign direct investment, competition policy, and especially the proliferation of preferential arrangements around the world that some view as posing a serious threat to the global trading system itself. All those issues have failed to even come onto the agenda of the WTO in a serious way and must do so in the near future. There is, I think, growing recognition that all these shortcomings in our global economic system have had at least one common cause: the increasing erosion of the political legitimacy of an international economic regime that was created so long ago, after the Second World War, on the basis of such a different distribution of economic weight among nations. A global economic order erected on the basis of economic positions in the middle of the 20th century could hardly be expected to thrive in the face of the dramatically altered power configuration of the early 21st century. And so we must turn to that issue to provide a foundation for a viable blueprint for global leadership in the 21st century, the topic of this keynote session of this very important forum. As Chancellor Schroeder said, the emerging market economies and the developing countries, including, of course, Korea at the forefront of that group of countries now accounts for slightly more than half the entire world economy, when real GDP is converted at purchasing power parity exchange rates. Even more importantly, the emerging markets and developing countries are growing 2 to 3 times as fast as the traditional high-income and rich countries. Prior to the crisis, they were growing at 6 to 7% annually, compared to 2 or 3% for the rich countries, and hence their share of the world economy was rising by 1 to 2 percentage points per year. It's now more than 50%. In another 10 or 15 years, it'll be 2/3, and it will continue to rise to where those countries increasingly play a dominant position in the global economy. They will increasingly dominate the global output totals in the way they have already come to dominate global growth. Asia is, of course, central to this dramatic change in the structure of the global economy. China is about to become the second largest national economy. India will probably become the third largest within the next couple of decades. Korea will clearly be in the top 10, and its place will rise over the years and decades ahead. The most noteworthy systemic impact of the crisis to date, reflecting this dramatic shift in the underlying structure of global economic power, has been the replacement of the G7 by the G20 as the chief steering committee for the world economy. Fully half of the new G20 are emerging or developing countries. It includes 5 Asian countries, or 7 if you count Australia and Russia, whereas the G7 had only 1 member from the Asian continent. This shift in the locus of global decision-making was inevitable in light of the rapid and dramatic shift in economic weight to which I refer, but the crisis probably accelerated its implementation by 5 to 10 years. When it came time to mobilize to deal with the deepest crisis since the 1930s, it was time to get serious about the international organizational arrangements and bring the countries that really counted into the room. And that brought the G20 to the fore, where it now will continue for the indefinite future. The next step is to replicate this fundamental change, G7 to G20, in the standing multilateral institutions. It has already occurred to some extent in the WTO, where the formal voting rules require consensus, but where leadership is actually exercised in a group of 5 or 6 key members that most recently has come to include China and India, along with the traditional United States, European Union, Japan. The most important remaining reforms are in the International Monetary Fund. It needs at least 4 types of changes: a substantial shift, at least 10 percentage points, in the quotas and voting rights from overrepresented Europeans, Mr. Chancellor, to underrepresented Asians. It requires a parallel shift of 4 to 6 of the seats around the board table at the IMF from the Europeans to the emerging market and developing countries. It probably requires an ending of the U.S. veto over many IMF decisions, which deeply irritates the rest of the membership and is actually unnecessary to defend U.S. interests. And finally, and perhaps most important, I think what we need is to appoint the next managing director of the IMF, the leader of the IMF. The next IMF chief should be from an emerging market economy, not from the traditional Europeans or even the United States. And there are many wonderful candidates from emerging economies who could lead the IMF into a new era. One is sitting here on this podium, Dr. SaKong Il from Korea. And it's a great pleasure for me to volunteer to be his campaign manager to become next head of the IMF. And I'm sure the audience will agree. There are other good candidates. Montek Ahluwalia from India, Governor Zhou Xiaoshuan of the People's Bank of China.
But who shall become Secretary General?
We'll talk about that in the Q&A period. The point is that all of our institutions need to reform fundamentally in the direction of providing a greater leadership role and responsibility for the emerging markets who are increasingly at the center of the global economy. Now, with the historic shifts in the political organization of the world going on, particularly with the move to the G20, it is now clear that the global economic order of the 21st century will look very different from its predecessors of the 20th century. It will cover a wider range of issues. It will have a very different governance structure that does reflect the dramatic changes in the distribution of economic weight. It will have a potentially greater role for regional arrangements, as are developing now here in Asia and following on the regional leadership that we have seen from Europe over the past 50 years. And we know that regional arrangements can either strengthen the global system, as I believe the European experience has done, or it could detract from global cooperation, as occurred all too destructively in the 1930s. And so as Asia develops its regional agreements going forward in the trade area, the monetary area, the need to align those regional initiatives with the global system in a positive and mutually reinforcing way are very important. But as we move into this new era, what are the issues that will be most important? Strengthening financial regulation, as stressed by Chancellor Schroeder, is the most urgent requirement for the extension of current systemic arrangements. Now, virtually all regulation will still, I think, take place at the national level in light of the need for legal enforcement and the inherent differences in national institutional frameworks. But those national steps must be integrated internationally, and I would envisage a three-step process. First, we try to reach, in the G20, an international consensus on best practices, global best practices that each country should adopt for key issues such as capital requirements for financial institutions, leverage ratios, liquidity ratios, resolution authorities, compensation practices, all the main topics that need to be reformed to prevent the next financial crisis need to be implemented against an international consensus on best practices and what strategies should be adopted by independent countries. Individual nations will then, I think, implement most of those strategies at the national level, but then we need to go back to international monitoring of the resulting programs to assess whether they meet the global best practices standards, and if not, how they can be strengthened to do so. This is a strategy that was essentially implemented after the Asian financial crisis a decade ago to implement the idea, new idea at the time, of an international banking standard that was agreed by everyone was needed to avoid replication of that financial crisis. Agreement was reached on what an international banking standard should include. Particularly emerging markets began to implement those reforms. The IMF monitored the practices through its so-called financial sector assessment programs of FSAPs, and the whole strategy produced such far-reaching reforms in a large number of emerging market economies, including notably Korea, that those countries were able to withstand the current crisis quite effectively. Indeed, many of the emerging economies suffered less disruption to their financial systems than did those of the rich industrial countries which had failed to update their regulatory systems as well. Now we need a similar approach for the high-income countries at the core of the global financial system to reduce the systemic risk of another crisis like that of the past 2 years. A second post-crisis reform must address the global imbalances to prevent their replication from again sowing the seeds of financial disruption as well as causing trade and other problems. The issue was simply that the huge trade deficits, in the case of the United States running to almost $800 billion at its peak 3 years ago, Chinese surplus over $400 billion, about half of that, produced such huge flows of capital into the United States that they kept monetary conditions far too easy and too loose. They provided far too much liquidity. They therefore generated huge incentives for excessive lending, excessive borrowing, underpricing of finance, and therefore played a central role in creating the conditions that created the international financial crisis. So these imbalances, though cut in half from their present peaks at the moment, require continued effort to avoid bringing them back. That, in turn, will require something that I mentioned before, more effective surveillance by the International Monetary Fund of national policies, perhaps along the lines proposed by President Lee Myung-bak and Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia, and largely adopted by the G20 at its latest meeting in Pittsburgh, under which all G20 member countries would submit their recovery strategies to the IMF. The IMF would then see if they fit with each other, and if not, would tell the countries who were not consistent with the overall global requirement to modify their policies accordingly. That's a tall order for the IMF. It requires the big member countries to conform their strategies to a global approach. It'll be a big test of the new system to see if that works, but it's clearly required if we are to avoid sowing the seeds of another global crisis. Exchange rates will, as always, be an important part of this picture. And there remains the systemic problem that the IMF has no leverage over the policies of surplus countries. So when China or Singapore or Taiwan competitively undervalue their currencies and run huge trade surpluses and pile up reserves that add to international imbalances, there is no effective way for the IMF to respond to that problem. And it may therefore be necessary to invoke the rules of the World Trade Organization, which also prohibit countries from taking such steps, to authorize trade actions if they persist in policies that disrupt the world economy and cause distortions of world trade. Another major contribution to avoiding the imbalances will be the creation of special drawing rights by the IMF on a more continuing basis. I mentioned it had already been done once earlier this year as part of the crisis response. But part of the problem going forward and the risk in creating new international imbalances is that many countries may take away from the crisis the lesson that they need to build up even larger international reserves to self-insure themselves against future crisis risks. Under current circumstances, that would require them to run big trade surpluses to earn the increase in reserves. That would tempt them to protect their markets against imports, competitively undervalue their currencies, and try to seize a competitive edge that would be destructive to the world economy. If the IMF were to create, say, $200 billion of more SDRs every year for the next 5 years, and distribute those to its membership along the lines of the traditional formula, that means countries could build their reserves without having to run trade surpluses and therefore place pressure on the global system that could cause many of the types of problems we have seen to be repeated. So there are a number of steps that can be taken under G20 leadership over these coming years that will help reduce the risk of future systemic instability. The largest new need for the global economic system is, of course, a comprehensive regime on global warming. Here, the new G20 Steering Committee must play a particularly important role, both to provide political impetus for the negotiations to limit emissions and to work out effective linkages between the new environmental regime and the rest of the economic order, particularly the trading system. As I mentioned before, countries will be reluctant to place limits on their own companies by way of carbon emissions if they fear that other countries will not take similar steps and thereby gain international competitive advantage. Trade conflicts can well result, and one systemic need is therefore to work out a new green code or other arrangements through which the trading system and the new climate change system are coordinated to avoid both disrupting the trading regime and reducing the chances that a climate change treaty can be worked out. So that's the agenda. I would conclude by suggesting that Korea can and indeed must play a pivotal role in designing and implementing this new blueprint. As I mentioned, Chancellor Schroeder mentioned, Chairman SaKong sitting here is at the center of that process. Korea is the next chair of the G20, which will lead the global effort in these directions over the coming year. It seems to me that Korea's unique international position provides it with particularly strong credentials and credibility to provide this leadership. It is certainly the example of the most dramatic success of economic development of any country in history, and its demonstration effect is enormously powerful. It will now be the first country outside the G7 to chair G20 summits and lead the global coordination process. It will be the first Asian country to do so. As a middle-income country, it can bridge the two groups, the richer countries, the poorer countries, that make up the G20 in a unique manner. With its strategic position between China and Japan, Korea has a promising opportunity to forge new global strategies that can win the support of the two Asian giants. And with its close ties to the United States, and thus its keen interest in maintaining strong trans-Pacific relationships, Korea is in a strong position to foster trans-Pacific initiatives in APEC and other ways to parallel the Asian regional initiatives that are underway, and in so doing, avoid the risks of tensions between Asia and the United States that could otherwise develop if those two sets of developments were not handled carefully and in parallel. Korea's chairmanship year will be particularly critical for the G20 as an institution. If it is to consolidate its new leadership opportunity and establish its credibility to both private markets and governments around the world. The G20 will have to make a smooth transition in this period from its previous sole focus of the last 2 years on crisis response, which was, of course, wholly appropriate, now to systemic management of more underlying and long-term structural issues. Since the crisis will not yet be fully resolved, even under the best of circumstances, over the next year, that means that the G20 agenda for 2010 is particularly challenging because it will have to address both the continued resolution of the crisis and start the process of dealing with the more lasting systemic questions. Hence, Korea, as chair, will have to assert leadership on both the carryover crisis topics that will still be important, such as the appropriate timing of exit strategies from fiscal and monetary stimulus, and the systemic issues that demand the attention of heads of state, such as the climate change negotiations and new efforts to re-energize the global trading system. And there will, of course, be issues that straddle these two time dimensions. Financial regulatory reform is needed to both assure lasting recovery from the current crisis and to provide a strengthened systemic defense against future disruption. Korea itself must, and I believe will, therefore, play a central role in devising and beginning to implement a blueprint for global leadership in the 21st century, the topic of this session. It is thus wholly appropriate, indeed necessary, that leading Korean institutions host this Global Human Resources Forum to help launch that process and provide the human capital and intellectual resources that are so essential to make this process happen. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the discussion and look forward to working with my Korean friends as they pursue this historic opportunity to help shape a new global economic order for the years and decades ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for very, very penetrating and illuminating analysis of current global issues, including ongoing global financial and economic crisis and the global governance system itself. Again, he covered most of the important the issues and areas. So I don't think I need to get into try to summarize what you just said. But one thing hit me hard is his view on the future of G20 as the informal global steering committee and Korea's chairmanship. And he put a daunting challenge, provided a daunting challenge for the G20 process, and particularly the Korea as chair country. is only about a year ahead, and we have to exert our leadership to make this G20 process itself credible and legitimate by producing more deliverables and measurable, the implementable measures, not just not just talks and rhetorics, but really come up with implementable measures and in improving the global governance system. You know, I think the G20 leaders made right decision in reforming the existing international financial architecture by choosing very practical approach instead of establishing the grandiose Bretton Woods II type of institutions, but they decided to improve the existing Bretton Woods institutions, namely IMF and the World Bank. And they decided to assign more responsibilities, give more responsibilities to these institutions, as Fred mentioned, and giving more the supervisory authority and so forth. But it needs a prerequisite to make these institutions operate efficiently and fulfill its responsibilities. And that is that the global community has to make these institutions politically legitimate and credible by reforming its current governance system. And in fact, during the last 3 G20 summit, the meetings, the leaders did agreed on this quota changes and much improvement in the Bretton Woods institutions. But there are still important critical issues remaining. And most of these issues involved the very serious conflict of interest among the countries involved. And because in most of cases, it's a kind of zero-sum game, because someone has to give up their own existing rights or positions to others. So it takes a lot of efforts and the leadership. In this regard, Korea has to work very, very hard with our counterparts, not only G20 members, but the other member countries which don't belong to G20. You know, today there are 192 members for United Nations. So out of 192, only 20 countries are represented in G20. So there are 172 countries which have to be persuaded that, and participated in this process. So we have a very daunting challenge before us. So we will get all the advices and the wisdom from the leading global thinkers and leaders. And we're very fortunate that we have the Chancellor Schroeder today and Fred Bergsten. I'm sure they will continuously advise us and provide the policy recommendations and suggestions. Well, with this, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. So if you have any comments or questions, maybe 1 or 2 persons from the floor. And please don't try to make a long speeches, but just be brief and just tell us who your question is directed to. Yes, as microphone, please. Just tell us who you are and who you direct whom you direct your questions to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Atsushi Seike from Keio University, Tokyo, Japan. Chancellor Schroeder raised three major crises, namely financial crisis, climate crisis, international security crisis, and I think three of these crises are very important, and I'm impressed with his analysis. And I think there is another serious crisis is going on, particularly for developed countries. That is a crisis of population, namely a rapid aging population with very drastic decline in the birth rate. And, if a current low birth rate, for example, in Japan, will continue, according to one calculation of a demographer, the last Japanese will be disappear within some hundred of years on the surface of this planet. So, Chancellor, I'm just curious to know your view on this, crisis of our population. Thank you.
We have the same situation in Europe, as you may know, aging society. The only answer I know and I try to give, and Mr. Bergsten mentioned it a little bit, was the so-called Agenda 2010. You have to realize that politicians have only a few possibilities to stimulate the birth rate in the country. It is private and should stay private, I think. And therefore, you only can reform the social systems in the country, because in an aging society, you get a financial problem in the social system. They depend on jobs and income of workers. And if you have an aging society, you have to reform the social system, the healthcare system, the pension system. And I try to do it in Germany. And I made one experience I would like to tell you. In a democratic society, politicians who wanted to make and must make reform have two major problems. One is, it is a problem of legitimating policy. One is, if you asked the people in your society, Japan or these countries the same, if a reform in social system is necessary, 85% would say, yes, it is. If they affected by the reform, you will get 15% if you have luck, not more. And the other more important problem in democratic societies and is that there is a gap, a time gap, between the decisions which has to make now and the positive consequences you will see 3 years later. And in this time gap, democratic legitimated politicians can fall. I know a little bit. I know it. And therefore, and that is interesting, therefore, because of this, some reforms which are necessary, national or, as you said, international, are not made. That is a problem. But it has to be in the Asian society, in Japan, in some countries in Asia, not all, of course, especially in Europe. But the problem for acting politicians every time is, are they willing to take the risk not to become re-elected or not? Some do, some not, and that is the answer I have.
Okay, just one more question. Yes.
I am Jung Taek-hyun from Inha University. I have a question directed to Dr. Bergsten. I appreciate that you mentioned that Korea will become an increasing role in the global world, and in short, you are saying that Korea will be one of the major actors in the world, including the G20. In this regard, I have a question regarding this Korea-US FTA. Korea-US FTA was signed 2 years ago, so delaying this agreement is not beneficial both to Korea and US. So my question is, when do you think the ratification will be made, particularly in US Congress? And the second question is, what the government should do to expedite this process? Thank you.
The United States, in my view, has made a huge mistake in not moving to rapid implementation of the FTA with Korea. It's now ironic that the free trade agreement between Korea and the European Union will probably take effect before the agreement between Korea and the United States. So the United States will lose out from new discrimination in two of its most important markets and is a significant loser by failing to move ahead. The reason for that is, of course, our domestic politics, where there has been a very strong backlash against globalization over the last 15 years since the NAFTA debate, and where the new Obama administration, which I support on most issues, has totally failed to develop any kind of trade policy and has been unwilling to try to resolve the deep divisions on trade issues within its own Democratic Party. That's particularly the case since the administration has had some very high priorities in other areas, healthcare reform in particular, and has not wanted to cause additional divisiveness within its own ranks by proceeding with trade. I think the good news is that the administration has already said very clearly that the Korean agreement is the most important of the outstanding FTAs, of which there are two others, left to it by the outgoing Bush administration. And so Korea could go ahead before the other FTAs. There's no need to hold back for the others, as had been the policy of the Bush administration. I think the next 2 weeks may be critical. As you all know, President Obama is coming to Asia starting a week from today. He will be going to Japan, then the APEC summit in Singapore, then China, and finally here to Korea. And it is certainly my strong hope that President Lee and the other top Korean officials with whom President Obama meets will make a very strong case to him for moving ahead quickly with the free trade agreement. President Obama does have these domestic political problems with trade that I mentioned, but he also has an overriding priority for his administration of strengthening America's global role, strengthening its foreign policy and its national security position, and particularly with respect to Asia. And that's why he's making this extensive trip to Asia and visiting all the major countries along with the APEC summit. I think it's very important for the Asian countries, notably Korea, but the others as well, to remind the president of my country that trade and economic issues are a central part of foreign policy. And it's very hard to conduct the kind of cooperative, successful, multilateral foreign policy that President Obama sincerely wants to carry out unless he is moving forward in a positive, cooperative, and constructive way on trade issues. And here in Asia, that requires, first of all, moving ahead promptly to implement the free trade agreement with Korea. I think it also means moving ahead with new trade initiatives in APEC to strengthen trade relationships across the Pacific as a whole. particularly since the United States will be chairing APEC in 2011, and the process needs to begin now of building up to that time when surely President Obama will want to have a major forward step in trade relationships across the Pacific. So I think the national interest of the United States in moving ahead with the Chorus agreement is clear, but we need a little help from our friends in other countries. And particularly here in Korea, where, as you said with the question, both our countries stand to benefit so much from that agreement, you need to urge our president very clearly, politely, privately perhaps, but very clearly that moving ahead with the free trade agreement is essential to solidify, strengthen, and build the very critically important relationship between the United States and Korea, and also between the United States and East Asia as a whole.
Well, thank you very much. Candid view on this, the FTA issue. I know there are many more who would like to raise questions and make comments, since it is a really, really rare opportunity for us to have this to the global thinkers and the policymakers of our time with us. But unfortunately, we are a little bit behind the schedule, so we have to close this first session, which in my view is really, really worth taking all of us listening and sharing the wisdom and knowledge. So with this, we should close, and please join me in thanking again these two keynote speakers.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for sharing your evaluation, your insights and remarks. 네, 감사합니다. 이번 기조연설은 대한민국과 나아가 전 세계의 인재들에게 절실히 필요한 글로벌 리더십에 관해서 함께 고민해보는 뜻깊은 시간이었습니다. 이런 명쾌하고 깊이 있는 인재에 대한 세계적 전문가의 해안을 엿볼 수 있다는 것이 바로 글로벌 인재 포럼만의 경쟁력이 아닐까 생각합니다. 훌륭한 세션을 만들어주신 401 위원장님, 게르하르드 슈레더 전 총리님, 프레드 버그스텐 소장님 모두 감사드리면서 이상으로 기조연설을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 참석해주신 내외 귀빈 여러분 한 분 한 분께 다시 한번 진심으로 감사의 인사를 드리면서 지금부터 약 10분간의 그 커피 브레이크를 갖도록 하겠습니다. 10시 45분, 10분 뒤에 45분에 기조 세션이 시작될 예정입니다. 많은 관심과 참여 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.